All right, guys, so today we're going to go over rate making, and this is all about how to set premium rates and how to adjust those rates based upon losses and historical experience. So when we think about adjusting premium, we're adjusting from historical values to the forecast or the future period. So we have premiums that used to be in play, and now we are adjusting them based upon losses and exposure information and profit information for the new forecast or the future period. So you have two different methods to actually calculate this. First, pure premium actually just gets the raw indicated premium, so the actual amount per exposure. And then the second method from the loss ratio method is you actually get the indicated average rate change, so the percentage change instead of the actual value. So for pure premium, you're getting the indicated premium per exposure. So this is the new indicated premium per exposure, and that's going to equal the loss cost or the losses over the number of exposures plus the fixed expenses per exposure over one minus the variable expense ratio minus the profit ratio. Right? And that's going to give you the that's going to give you the indicated premium per exposure, right, that we should have for the future, for the forecast period. Now, these losses are trended and developed. That's one thing to note. Second method is indicated average rate change. So this is indicated premium, so the new premium over the current premium, right? So the change of that, the ratio of that is equal to the losses, which are again trended and developed. So think chain ladder over the current premium. So that's the loss ratio, right? That is the loss ratio over the current premium. And this current premium is brought to the current rate level through the parallelogram method, plus the fixed expenses over current premium over the permissible loss ratio. So that is how we get the indicated average rate change. And this is overall rate change across all different risk categories or risk relativities. Now we have the fundamental premium equation of premium losses plus expenses plus profit. One thing to note here is there may be some times where you're actually given just the variable expenses or just the even like the profit, right? Profit amount. And that is due to if you multiply the indicated premium by the variable expense ratio or by the profit ratio, then you actually get the raw dollar amounts. And then rate change, and again, as I said, rate change and the indicated premium per exposure are overall, and they're not for specific rating variables. So they are across all different classes, all different rating variables. They are not for a specific territory or a specific class in a rating variable. They are for the overall across all rating variables. Now, if we have multiple different classes, we have multiple different risk categories of a single rating variable. Now we have indicated relativity and we have current relativity. The premium that we calculated from before, the indicated average rate change or the pure premium or the indicated premium from the pure premium method was based off of current relativity. So current relativity is from the base class, how risky are these other classes? So class A versus class C compared to class B, if B is the base class. A riskier class is going to have a higher premium, right? A class that has a lower risk is going to have a lower premium. So that is the entire purpose of current relativity. Current relativity is, again, you can think of these as default riskiness, where we do not take into account the loss experience or the loss data. Now, when we do account those, then we get the indicated relativity. So the indicator relativity is the current relativity, which is prior to the adjustment of the losses. Now we multiply that by the ratio of the loss ratio of I, so the class I over loss ratio of the base, right? So that is our adjustment from the actual loss experience. So this is losses over premium, right? Losses over premium. That is our adjustment from the actual loss experience. And that represents what we have to change the current relativity by to get the indicated relativity. And then that indicated relativity is the actual adjustment we would make to our base class for the other classes, right? So for class A, we would multiply that by indicated relativity for class A, given that B is the base class. So that is indicated in current relativity. For pure premium, you would do again a similar thing where you want to get the indicator relativity, but instead we first method was we used the loss ratio to get the indicator relativity. This time we're using pure premium, so we're taking the ratio of the losses and exposures of class I over the base class. Now this isn't just a number of exposures. Okay, this isn't just the number of exposures. You have to adjust the number of exposures by a certain amount. And this is because we have to take into account the varying distribution of exposures between different risk categories. So you can't just do the number of loss or the loss amount over the number of exposures and the base loss amount over the number of exposures. You have to adjust the number of exposures. And how do we adjust the number of exposures? Well, it's the actual rate. So the premium over the exposures over the base rate, right? So the base rate is for the base class, but then for the other ones, it's a different rate depending on the current relativity, right? And the actual rate is also referred to as the average rate. The average rate is the actual premium per exposure, right? The actual premium per exposure is the actual or average rate, and the base rate is what is given to us, right? And that is the adjustment that is made to the exposures. And when we multiply that by the number of exposures, that is our adjusted exposures. And then that's our denominator for the loss. And then we can get the indicated relativity after that. Now, one of the things is that when we calculated average rate change in the very beginning, that was independent from when we actually calculated indicated relativity. So when we do PI over PC and we want it to equal 10%, right? If we do PI indicated premium over current premium, and if we want it to equal 10%, right, we have to change the base rates not by 10%. It has to be by some different amount, right? Some different amount, probably 8% or 12%, right? But we have to change it by a different amount in order to get the overall premium to be 10% because those two entities were calculated differently, right? How you calculated indicated relativity was different than how you calculated average rate change. Right? So to make sure that those two are aligned, right? To make sure that those two are aligned, you have to multiply the rate by actually some different amount. Now, how do we get that different amount? That is what we call the off-balance factor, which is the weighted average of the indicated relativity by the exposures over the weighted average of the current relativity by the exposures. Right? So that's the off-balance factor. Reciprocal of that is balance back factor. So when you then you multiply the base rate, by the overall average rate change. So this is what you get from your loss ratio method over the off-balance factor, right? So that is your adjustment. You're dividing by the off-balance factor. And that is what you increase the base rate by. You don't increase the base rate by just the overall average rate change. You increase it by overall average rate change over the off-balance factor. And then when you calculate the total premium over the total current premium, right? Total indicated premium over current premium, then that should equal 10% or the average rate change that you actually calculated in the beginning using the loss ratio method. If you're using pure premium method, you get the indicated base rate that you got from the pure premium method, and you divide that by the indicated average relativity, which is the weighted average of the relativities, right? Now, if you have two rating variables, what you do is you take the product of the relativities to get a relativity of class X and class A, given that X and A are a part of two different rating variables. There can also be weighted weighted relativities. So you want to have, maybe you want to have a weight to indicated relativity and current relativity. Maybe you want to assign different weights to those. You can do that through having some weight factor. Now, how does this visually how does this look? Again, as I mentioned, you have a current relativity. Current relativity is before you account for the loss experience or the loss data, what is the riskiness of each of these classes? Indicator relativity is after you have adjusted for those loss data and that loss experience, what is the new riskiness or the risk classification of these different categories? You're going to have a premium, typically the actual premium for each of these classes, going to have the number of exposures, right? You're going to have a base rate, and you multiply the base rate by the current relativity to get the rates for the other ones. And then if you have a future rate, right? If you have a future rate, then you can multiply that a base rate by whatever the ratio is, right? To get to the to when you if you do loss ratio method, to get to the rate for the forecast period, and then you divide by the off balance factor, right after multiplying by the indicated relativity. Now, similar for deductibles, or similar to the relativities here, we also have relativities for concepts of deductibles and policy limits. So this is referring to when we have the same number of exposures in a given class. So either you have an overall you're referring to the entire population as a whole, regardless of splitting it into classes, or you're referring to just one class individually. So you're referring to, in general, one group of exposures. Right? You're referring to one group of exposures. And within those one group of exposures, you have different policy limits or you have different levels of deductibles that you want to test, essentially. Right? So when you're testing for these different policy limits or different deductibles, increased limit factor is the indicated relativity. So this is expected value of X, policy limit U, expected value of X, policy limit B. Increased limit factor is also same as like some of the severity topics that we talked about before. And then increased limit factor, sometimes there is also a risk load factor, and this risk load factor is there to account for the uncertainty of having increased covered loss. This will typically be like a function that is given in the exam question. Next is loss elimination ratio. This is when we have deductibles. So how much is the insurer payment decreased when they introduce a deductible or when they introduce a new deductible? So that is the 1 minus the loss ratio of D is the indicator relativity for that. And that at a high level is essentially relativities and rate making. One of the other things I would say to go over is when you're calculating LAS of D and LAS of B, just keep in mind that when you get to like E expected value of like X infinity, where the limit is infinity, that is just the same thing as expected value of X, right? So that's another thing. So that's high level, some of the main concepts of rate making. And again, conceptually, it is we have a rate, we want to see what the rate would be in a future or forecast period. So those two methods are pure premium and loss ratio. Now, for different classes, there may be different rates, right? Because each one introduces a different level of risk. And to assess those different levels of risk, we have current relativity. Now, if those are adjusted for the actual loss experience, that is referred to as indicator relativity, right? And then we can use the indicator relativity to get the rates for the classes in the forecast period after we've determined a off balance factor, right? From the original rate change that we've calculated. Right? So we're calculating this overall rate change in the beginning, or the overall premium in the beginning, right? Then we are finding the indicated relativity for each of the classes. Then we are adjusting that initial value that we got, right? We are adjusting the initial value that we got by either the off balance factor or if it's loss ratio, or by the weighted average of the current relativities. If it's pure premium, we're adjusting it by that amount, right? To get to the actual amount that the base rate should be increased by, to get such that the ratio of the premiums, if it's loss ratio, equals to the original calculation that we made in the first place. So that's a high level of what we are doing. So that's rate making. I'll see you in the next video.